Evelyn Hargrove pressed her back against the freezing limestone, her fingers trembling as she clutched a heavy brass tripod slick with blood that wasn't hers. Through the deafening roar of the mountain's interior, she stared at the sheriff's silver badge pinned to a ritualistic robe, discarded near a pile of human belongings. The rhythmic, guttural whispers, vibrating through the cave walls, weren't coming from the cultists. They were coming from the rock itself. Just as the floor began to heave like a living chest, Silas stepped into the flickering light of her dying headlamp. He didn't raise a weapon. He simply gestured toward the jagged shaft behind him, where a massive, shifting shadow was rising to meet the surface. "It's not a mineral vein you found, Evelyn," he rasped over the sound of grinding stone. "It's a throat, and it's been hungry for a very long time." As the first rhythmic pulse of the shadow touched her mind, Evelyn realized the scientific evidence in her bag wasn't her salvation. It was an invitation. The water hissed against the limestone, a wet whisper that slithered through the sinkhole's throat. Evelyn Hargrove's fingers clawed into the mud, her breath coming in ragged bursts that fogged the air in front of her face. The flashlight beam trembled, cutting through the dark like a blade, just enough to see the camera's shattered lens half buried in the silt. She yanked it free, the plastic casing slick with algae, and the weight of it nearly dragged her wrist into the rising sludge. The limestone walls seemed to press inward, slick with a gelatinous moisture that felt less like water and more like a slow, mineral sweat. Every muscle in her forearms screamed as she fought the suction of the freezing mud, her boots sinking past the ankles. The Appalachian spring had brought a deluge, and the sinkhole was transforming into a drowning pool. She couldn't lose this camera. The motion sensor had triggered 3 nights ago, and it held the only digital record of whatever had bypassed her perimeter. Above, the gray sky was a bruised smudge, visible only through the jagged maw of the hole. She grunted, a low guttural sound, and finally heaved the device onto a higher ledge. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. The rock didn't lie, but it certainly didn't make things easy. Once the camera was secured in her waterproof bag, Evelyn wiped a smear of grit from her cheek, only to replace it with a fresh streak of muck. She turned the light toward the deeper recesses of the throat, where the water swirled into a dark, gurgling drain. The beam caught on something synthetic. She waded deeper, the cold biting through her thermal leggings. There, snagged on a protrusion of sharp flowstone, lay a tangle of nylon cords and a collapsed tent, sagging like a dead thing. Then another, and another. 3 distinct campsites, or what remained of them, were clustered in the transition zone of the cave. Evelyn crouched, her knees sinking into the damp earth. The first site reeked of stale smoke and something sour. Spilled beer, maybe, or the sharp tang of fear sweat. A sleeping bag lay unzipped, its synthetic fibers clumped with dirt. A half-eaten protein bar, its wrapper torn open by teeth or rodents, sat on a rock like an offering. She reached for it, then stopped. Fingerprints smudged the plastic. Fresh. The hikers hadn't packed up. They hadn't fled in an orderly fashion. They had simply ceased to be present. Their gear remained, expensive, high-end equipment that no seasoned trekker would abandon to the elements. It felt like a stage set where the actors had been pulled into the wings by invisible wires. The weight of the silence in the cave grew heavy, a physical pressure against her eardrums. Evelyn retreated from the campsites, her mind racing through geological explanations for sudden disappearances, subsidence, flash floods, carbon dioxide pockets. But the neatly arranged gear defied the chaos of nature. She climbed out of the sinkhole, her breath hitching as she crested the rim and looked toward her research station. The structure was a decaying ruin of weathered pine. Clinging to the slope, as if the earth were trying to pull it under. Inside, she knew, the desk was buried under a fresh layer of dust and a growing stack of unpaid bills. A final warning notice from the electric company sat on top, its red ink a mocking contrast to the drab interior. The university had stopped answering her emails 3 weeks ago. Her professional sanctuary, the place where she had hoped to vindicate her father's memory and her own career, was rotting from the inside out. The centrifuge was silent. The microscope sat under a shroud of plastic, and the very air smelled of mildew and failure. She was 34, and she was standing on the edge of a literal and metaphorical abyss. Clutching a broken camera as if it were a holy relic, she slung the heavy gear bag over her shoulder, the straps digging into her calloused skin, and began the trek back through the dense hardwood forest. The oaks and maples stood like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches twisting like arthritic fingers against the leaden sky. Every snapped twig sounded like a gunshot. Suddenly, the shadows between the trees shifted. Silas Whitaker emerged from the laurel thicket like he'd been grown from the dirt itself, his hulking frame blocking the narrow trail. Behind him, 3 other men, local woodsmen with faces carved from the same hard limestone as the mountains, fanned out in a loose semicircle. Silas wore a long, oil-stained duster, his pale, watery blue eyes fixed on Evelyn with a chilling intensity. He didn't move. He simply occupied the space, a mountain of a man, with knuckles split and scabbed from a lifetime of hard labor. The air between them grew thick, charged with a sudden, predatory electricity. Evelyn's grip tightened on the strap of her bag. Her pulse throbbed in her neck, a frantic rhythm that matched the tapping of her finger against the bag's canvas. "You're not supposed to be down here," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that made the hair on her arms stand up. He stepped forward, his slow, deliberate limp suggesting a hidden weight he was dragging behind him. "The mountain has a way of swallowing things that don't belong. You're disturbing the peace, Miss Hargrove. Sacred ground doesn't take kindly to wires and glass." Evelyn didn't flinch, though her insides felt like water. "The rock doesn't care about sacred, Silas. It cares about pressure and erosion. People are missing. 3 campsites worth of people. I'm not leaving until I see what's on this sensor." "You're not listening to the ground," Silas countered, his left eye twitching, a tell she'd noted before. "You're just scratching at the skin. We told you to stay in your shack. Now, you're going to hand over that bag and walk back to the road." One of the younger men, a wiry fellow with a jagged scar across his chin, lunged forward. He didn't ask. He reached for the strap of her gear bag with a snarl. The movement was sudden, breaking the tension like a snapped cable. Evelyn's instincts, honed by years of navigating treacherous terrain and even more treacherous academic politics, flared into white-hot defiance. She didn't scream. She didn't plead. As the man's fingers closed around the canvas, she swung her heavy brass tripod, the one with the reinforced legs, with every ounce of desperate strength she possessed. The metal connected with the man's ribs with a sickening thud. He gasped, his air leaving him in a sharp whistle, and his grip slackened. Evelyn didn't wait to see if he'd get up. She spun on her heel, her boots churning up the wet leaf litter as she dove headlong into the impenetrable wall of the laurel thicket. The chase was a blur of whipping branches and stinging leaves. The laurel was a maze, a claustrophobic tangle that caught at her jacket and scratched her face. But she knew the contours of this specific ridge better than they did. She could hear them behind her. The heavy thud of Silas's boots, the cursing of the man she'd struck. They moved with a practiced, communal silence that was far more terrifying than any shouting. Evelyn scrambled over a moss-slicked log, her lungs burning, her heart a frantic drumbeat in her ears. She forced herself to breathe through her nose, to stay low. to move like the shadows she was trying to inhabit. The fog was rolling in, a thick, milky soup that clung to the ground and muffled the world. She saw a gap in the limestone, a small fissure hidden by a curtain of ferns, and she threw herself into it, pressing her back against the cold, damp stone. As she lay there, her chest heaving, her eyes caught something snagged on a low-hanging branch just inches from her face. It was a scrap of fabric, bright blue Gore-Tex, the kind used in high-end hiking jackets. But it wasn't just the fabric that stopped her heart. The tree trunk it was snagged on had been stripped of its bark in a precise, rhythmic pattern. Deep, jagged symbols were etched into the wood, arranged in a spiral that seemed to draw the eye toward the center of the tree. These weren't animal scratchings. There was a deliberate, ritualistic intent to the carvings, a geometry that felt ancient and wrong. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and plucked the scrap of fabric from the branch. It felt like a cold, wet tongue against her palm. The sounds of the pursuit faded into the distance, the woodsmen moving further down the ridge, led astray by a deliberate trail of snapped branches she'd left earlier. Evelyn waited until the silence was absolute, save for the drip of condensation from the leaves. She crept out of the fissure and made a wide, sweeping arc back toward her station. When the sagging roof finally appeared through the mist, she didn't feel relief. She felt like a hunted animal returning to a compromised burrow. She slipped through the heavy metal door, her hands shaking as she slammed the bolt home and reinforced it with a heavy chain. The darkness of the station was a temporary shroud. She didn't turn on the lights. Instead, she navigated by memory to her workbench, the smell of mildew and old paper rising to meet her like a familiar, rotting embrace. She fumbled for her magnifying glass and a small desk lamp, shielding the light with a piece of cardboard. She laid the scrap of blue fabric on the scarred wood. Her breath hitched. She had expected to see the jagged, frayed edges of a tear, something caused by a branch or a claw. But under the lens, the truth was much colder. The edges of the fabric were perfectly clean, the synthetic fibers severed with a precision that only a razor-sharp blade could achieve. It was a surgical cut, executed with a steady hand. The wild animal sightings the locals whispered about, the mountain spirits Silas used as a shield, it was all a lie. This was human. This was calculated. The realization felt like a bucket of ice water poured down her spine. The disappearances weren't accidents of nature. They were executions. A soft glow caught her eye through the grimy window pane. She froze, her hand hovering over the fabric. Far down the slope, near the edge of her cleared perimeter, a flashlight beam cut through the fog. It moved with a slow, rhythmic sweep. Too steady for a hiker, too deliberate for a hunter. Then she saw the silhouette, the broad-brimmed hat, the stiff posture of authority. It was Sheriff Daniel Mercer. He wasn't searching for the missing hikers. He was walking alongside Silas, their figures merging and separating in the mist as they spoke in hushed tones. Mercer stopped, looked directly toward the dark station, and adjusted his belt in a way that made the silver of his badge catch the weak light. He wasn't there to protect her. He was the sentry for the people who wanted her gone. The law in this county didn't end at the courthouse. It ended at the tree line, where it shook hands with the dark. The next morning brought no sun, only a thickening of the gloom. A sharp rap on the metal door made Evelyn jump, her hand instinctively flying to the heavy brass tripod she'd kept by the bed. It wasn't Silas. It was a courier, a young man from the city who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. He refused to step onto the porch, standing instead in the mud with his engine running, his eyes darting toward the dark eaves of the forest. He thrust a manila envelope toward her and fled before she could even say thank you. Inside was the finality she'd been dreading. A formal notice of funding termination from the university's Board of Regents. They cited lack of actionable data and unprofessional conduct in the field. She had 48 hours. At noon on the second day, they would remotely kill the satellite uplink and the power grid. She was being erased. The ultimatum acted like a catalyst. If she had 48 hours, she would spend every second of them proving they were wrong. She packed a fresh bag with high-sensitivity seismic sensors and her last working infrared cameras. She wouldn't play it safe anymore. She headed deeper into the woods, toward the black zones Silas had warned her away from. She worked with a feverish, frantic energy, burying sensors near the carved trees, her calloused fingers digging into the cold earth until her nails bled. She was a scientist, damn it. The rock didn't lie. If there was a reason people were vanishing, it was in the strata, in the vibrations, in the tangible world. She wouldn't let them turn her life's work into a ghost story. But when she returned to the sites where she'd placed her previous cameras, the forest had changed. The cameras were gone, not just stolen, but replaced. In their stead stood crude wooden effigies, lashed together with twine and strips of stained fabric. They were featureless, save for deep gashes where eyes should be. As she approached one, she realized it was leaking. A thick, foul-smelling resin, dark as old blood and smelling of copper and rot, coated the wooden limbs and pooled on the ground. It was a marking, a territory claim. The rhythmic carvings on the trees seemed to pulse in her peripheral vision. She felt a low-frequency hum start in the soles of her feet, a vibration that didn't match any seismic activity she'd ever recorded. It made her molars ache. It felt like the mountain was humming a tune only her bones could hear. She turned to head back, the weight of the effigy's sightless gaze pressing against her back. The fog had turned into a wall of white wool. As she reached the station, she grabbed the heavy iron handle of the exterior door. It didn't budge. She pulled harder, her boots slipping in the mud. The door was bolted, from the outside. A heavy iron bar had been dropped into the brackets she'd never used. She was locked out of her own sanctuary, standing in the open as the light began to fail. Then, from the heart of the mist, came a sound that shattered her composure. A high, giggling laugh. A child playing hide-and-seek in the gray. "Who's there?" she barked, her voice cracking. "Silas? Daniel? This isn't funny." The laughter echoed, seemingly coming from all directions at once. It was light, innocent, and utterly terrifying. She swung her flashlight, the beam dying in the thick fog. She saw a shadow move, small, quick, near the corner of the shed. She lunged toward it, but there was nothing but the smell of wet earth and the sound of her own frantic breathing. Then, an orange glow flickered at the edge of the tree line. Silas's men emerged, carrying torches. They didn't come for her directly. They began to touch the flames to the dry laurel brush and the deadfall surrounding the station. The fire took hold with a hungry roar, fueled by the resin-heavy wood. "Smoke her out!" a voice yelled. Mercer's voice, stripped of its charming veneer. The heat was instantaneous. The smoke a thick, choking blanket that burned her throat. Evelyn realized she couldn't stay by the door. She was being funneled. She remembered the fire extinguisher in the external storage locker. She smashed the plastic cover with her elbow, ignored the glass cutting her skin, and hauled the heavy canister out. As the first of the woodsmen stepped through the smoke, his face twisted in a predatory grin, Evelyn pulled the pin. She didn't aim for the fire. She aimed for his eyes. A blinding cloud of white chemical powder erupted, swallowing the man. He screamed, clutching his face. Evelyn swung the canister like a mace, feeling the satisfying jar as it connected with his shoulder. And then she ran. She didn't run for the road. They'd be waiting there. She ran for the only dark place left, the narrow, jagged mouth of the limestone caves. The transition from the heat of the fire to the damp chill of the cave was like stepping into a tomb. Evelyn scrambled through the narrow entrance, her breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed off the glistening walls. She pushed deep into the dark, squeezing through fissures that would have terrified her a week ago. She found a small, dry ledge in a secondary chamber and collapsed, her heart hammering against her ribs. As she sat there, trying to steady her hands, her flashlight beam caught a flash of silver in a rock crevice. She reached in and pulled out a bundle of heavy fabric. It was a ritualistic robe, made of coarse, dark wool, stained with that same copper-smelling resin. Pinned to the chest, gleaming with a mocking brightness, was Sheriff Daniel Mercer's silver badge. The pieces shifted in her mind like tectonic plates. The poverty of the town, the sacred ground, the hostility toward her research. It wasn't about spirits. She remembered the core samples she'd taken months ago, the ones the university had told her were inconclusive. There was a vein of something in this mountain, something rare and incredibly valuable. Not just a mineral, but a biological anomaly that looked like crystal. They weren't protecting a curse, they were protecting a harvest. The disappearances were just a way to keep the federal government and outside corporations from looking too closely at a town that should have been dead decades ago. They were a cult of greed, and the sheriff was their high priest. But the mountain had other plans. As she sat in the dark, a low rhythmic roar began to vibrate through the limestone. It wasn't wind. It was a sound of immense, pressurized breathing. Outside, the sky finally broke. A violent Appalachian storm erupted, the kind that turned small creeks into raging rivers in minutes. Within an hour, a massive mudslide thundered down the ridge, the sound like a freight train. She felt the vibration through the cave floor. The road was gone. Her phone, which she'd been trying to use to find a signal, went dead as the external lines were severed. She was truly alone, trapped in the throat of the mountain with a group of murderers above her and something she couldn't name below. She retreated deeper into the cave system, her flashlight beam growing weak. The air grew warmer, more humid. She found herself in a hidden, dry chamber that the water hadn't reached. Her light swept across the floor, and she stopped, her knees buckling. Piles of backpacks, wallets, wedding rings, and hiking boots were arranged in neat, macabre rows. There were dozens of them. This wasn't just a few missing hikers. This was a generational harvest. She found a portable tape recorder near a pile of gear that looked like it belonged to a researcher from the 70s. With trembling fingers, she pressed play. The voice that emerged was thin, distorted by age and fear. "It's not a vein," the voice whispered through the static. "We thought it was quartz, but it's vascular. It's feeding. The town, they think they're getting rich, but they're just the stable hands. They're feeding it so it doesn't have to come out and find its own food. It's not a mine. It's a gut." The tape ended in a scream that was cut short by a wet, tearing sound. Evelyn dropped the recorder, the plastic clattering on the stone. The mineral vein wasn't a resource. It was a predatory force. The town wasn't protecting a mine. They were serving a god of flesh and stone. "He was a smart man, that one," a voice said from the shadows. Silas stepped into the chamber from a narrow side passage, his oil-stained duster damp with cave sweat. He held a heavy hunting knife, the blade dull and notched. He blocked the only path back to the upper levels, His pale eyes seemed to glow in the weak light of her fading flashlight. "You geologists," Silas rasped, stepping closer. "Always looking for the why in the dirt. You never stop to think that the dirt might have a why for you. The mountain is hungry, Evelyn. It's been hungry since before your people had names for the stars. We just keep it quiet. We keep it sleeping. And in return, it gives us enough to stay alive." Evelyn backed away, her mind racing. She was near a specific limestone formation she'd mapped weeks ago, a natural acoustic amplifier. "You're not keeping it quiet, Silas. You're just the first course." She didn't wait for him to lung. She threw her head back and screamed. Not a scream of fear, but a sharp, sustained note aimed directly into a narrow, vertical crevice in the wall. The acoustics of the chamber caught the sound, bouncing it, amplifying it, turning her voice into a deafening, discordant roar that vibrated through the very bones of the mountain. Silas staggered, dropping the knife as he clutched his ears, his face contorting in agony. The sonic vibration was a physical blow in the enclosed space. Evelyn scrambled past him, her heart in her throat, diving into a tunnel that glowed with a faint, sickly luminescence. She reached the end of the tunnel and stopped. The walls weren't rock anymore. They were composed of pulsating, organic structures. Veins of translucent, crystalline matter that throbbed with a slow, rhythmic heartbeat. It was beautiful and horrific. A cathedral of living stone. She reached out, her fingers brushing the surface before she could stop herself. A psychic jolt, like 1,000 volts of pure memory, slammed into her brain. She saw the town's history, not as a series of events, but as a series of feedings. She saw Silas as a young man, dragging a hiker into the dark. She saw the mountain waking up, its tendrils reaching through the soil of the valley. And the townspeople realized that the only way to stop it was to give it what it wanted. They weren't greedy. They were terrified. They were feeding the beast to keep the world outside from noticing the monster in their backyard. "The whispers," Silas said, appearing at the mouth of the tunnel, his ears bleeding, his voice sounding far away. "They weren't for us, Evelyn. They were for you. It's been waiting for someone who knows how to listen. It doesn't want a hiker. It wants a host. It wants eyes that can see the world so it can finally know what it's eating." Behind Silas, a group of masked cultists, the sheriff at the head, appeared. They stood in a silent, human wall, their robes dark against the glowing walls. They were the honor guard for a sacrifice. Then, the ground behind Evelyn began to shift. The deep, vertical shaft at the end of the chamber erupted in a silent, billowing mass of shadow. It wasn't smoke. It was a physical presence, a shifting, impossible geometry of blackened tendrils and veined sacs. It rose like a tide, its dozens of eyes blinking in unison. Evelyn was cornered. The cultists in front, the biological god behind. The cave floor buckled under the sudden, immense pressure of the storm above and the entity below. A massive limestone shelf directly above her groaned and gave way. Tons of rock thundered down. Evelyn tried to jump, but a jagged slab caught her leg, pinning her to the damp floor. The pain was a white-hot explosion that erased the world for a second. She lay there, gasping, her leg a mangled ruin beneath the stone as the shadow loomed over her, its cold, copper scent filling her lung. Her scientific rationalism, the armor she'd worn since her father vanished, finally shattered. There was no geological explanation for the way the shadow's eyes seemed to reflect her own grief. She saw Silas approach, and as he drew closer, he pulled back his sleeve. His arms were covered in rhythmic, parasitic scars, thick, rope-like keloids that throbbed in time with the walls. "It's not so bad," Silas whispered, kneeling beside her. "After a while, you stop being you. You just become part of the is. You'll be the bridge, Evelyn. You'll be the one who tells it where the rest of them are." Evelyn looked up at the ceiling. Her geologist's eye, even through the haze of pain, saw the structural weakness. The explosion of the gas pocket earlier, the pressure of the mudslide, the entire vaulted ceiling of this chamber was a keystone. She fumbled for her gear bag, which had been thrown just out of reach. Her fingers brushed the strap. She hauled it to her breath coming in shallow, ragged sobs. She pulled out her last emergency flare and a pressurized canister of sampling gas, pure, highly flammable methane she'd collected from the lower vents. "The rock doesn't lie, Silas," she wheezed, her voice a bloody rasp. "And the rock says this ceiling is coming down." She didn't hesitate. She cracked the flare against the stone, the brilliant crimson light blinding the cultists for a heartbeat. She threw the flare directly into the stream of the gas canister as she punctured the valve with her rock hammer. The resulting explosion was a controlled, directed burst of force. It wasn't enough to kill the entity, but it was enough to shatter the keystone in the ceiling. The sound was the end of the world. The limestone roof groaned, shrieked, and then collapsed in a cascading roar of thunder. Tons of mountain fell. The ritual chamber, the cultists, the pulsating veins, all were buried in a chaotic tomb of debris. The shadow let out a sound that wasn't a sound, but a vibration that nearly liquefied Evelyn's internal organs. In the chaos, the shifting rocks freed her leg. She didn't feel the pain anymore. She felt nothing but the primal urge to move. She dragged herself through a narrow drainage pipe, the freezing rainwater washing the blood and resin from her skin. She emerged into the torrential rain, the mountain behind her groaning as the internal collapse continued. The research station was a smoldering ruin. She crawled, she stumbled, she dragged her mangled leg through the mud until the trees began to thin. She reached the county line sign, the tilted, peeling wooden marker, and collapsed. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her were the flashing blue and red lights of the state police. Their sirens a beautiful, artificial scream against the silence of the woods. Weeks later, Evelyn sat in a sterile apartment in Nashville. The university had offered her a settlement to keep her quiet, and she'd taken it. Her leg would never fully heal, but she could walk with a cane. The authorities had called it a catastrophic natural landslide. Silas and Mercer were officially listed as missing, presumed dead. She was safe. She was out. She sat by the window, watching the rhythmic flow of the city traffic. The hum of the tires on the asphalt, the vibration of the air conditioners, the pulse of the city's heart. It was all so orderly. But then, she felt it. A low-frequency throb in the base of her skull. A rhythmic whisper that didn't come from the street, but from the spaces between her thoughts. She looked at her arm. Beneath the skin of her forearm, a faint, crystalline vein throbbed in time with the traffic. The shadow hadn't stayed in the mountain. It had found its eyes. She closed them, and for a second, she wasn't in the city anymore. She was back in the dark, and the mountain was finally, perfectly awake.